Okay, are we good to go?
We're good.
All right. Well, thank you. Well, thanks everybody for attending today's presentation. The ASTM E1527-13 is up for revision, and the ASTM Phase 1 Environmental Task Group has met diligently to review the standard. There are a number of potential modifications that environmental professionals and users should be aware of as the review and balloting process nears its conclusion. I would like to introduce Julie Kilgore. Julie is the president of Wasatch Environmental, an environmental science and engineering firm based out of Salt Lake City, Utah. Julie has over 25 years of experience in environmental assessment, investigations, remediation, and regulatory agency coordination. Julie chairs the task group responsible for reviewing the E1527 standard practice for environmental assessments, Phase 1 environmental assessment process, and served on the ASTM International Board of Directors. Julie was appointed by the EPA as one of the environmental professional representatives on the Regulatory Negotiation Federal Advisory Committee to assist the EPA in developing the federal appropriate inquiry regulations that ultimately adopted by reference the ASTM 1527-05 standard practice. Julie?
Hello, everybody, and first and foremost, I must express my apologies for the mix-up last month. I had you on my schedule, but the wrong time zone, so it was entirely my mistake. So I'm so pleased that you forgave me and invited me to come back again. As Scott said, we're getting very close to finalizing the process. I want to talk a little bit about the revision process. So Scott, if we can get to that revision process slide. Hit that button about 5 or 6 times until you get to the final line about the anticipated date. Our task group was formally convened in 2018, so we've been at this for about 3 years. And the 2 objectives that really drive what it is that we do is clarifying existing language where there's confusion or wide variations in interpretation, and strengthen the deliverable. That's the one thing we hear consistently every time we do a revision to the standard. The user community wants to have reports that are well written, that they're clear, that they understand the research and the outcomes. So in this particular process, we got together, we've got about 200, I have about 250 people on the task group right now. When we start this process, we all toss around ideas. What are the pain points? Our attorneys on the task group bring information about where there's litigation. Some folks who serve as expert witnesses on cases, on lawsuits that never get that far. So we get a lot of information. And from that, we form these focus groups and just work through the language and go through a balloting process. We just today issued what, fingers crossed, I'm hoping is our final ballot, our 4th and final ballot. But we do have an obligation to address all comments, any negative ballots that come in. So it's not certain until it's done. The goal is to reach consensus, but I do have to say that doesn't mean unanimous. So we do have a few disagreements on a couple of key items. I'll talk a little bit about some of the debate as we look at some of the specific issues. And then we have a process I have to go through if the bulk of the task group supports the existing language. So all of that lays the background for the anticipation of having a 1527 standard published by late fall of this year. Moving on to the next slide, a little bit on what the revision drivers are. I'd mentioned the review of recent litigation and claims that provides us some insight where the standard can be improved. But the thing that we really, that frames what we do is the federal mandate in the CERCLA, in the federal legislation that says all appropriate inquiries must be conducted consistent with good commercial and customary practice. So if you have a copy, and anybody doing this work should have a copy of the 1527 standard, you'll see that phrase in there several times and up front and center in section 1. the 1527 defines a good commercial customary practice. So a lot of what we're doing as a task group is gauging exactly that. What are we doing? What are environmental professionals doing? What reflects good commercial customary practice? That's a really important concept as I talk about some of those areas where we had a lot of debate, and that was the driver that we were looking to define. As a third bullet on the drivers, you'll see the ASTM is a process of consensus among users and producers, right? We can't have it, our task group and our committee cannot be outweighed on one side or the other. We do have a lot of environmental professionals participating in the task group, about 170 or so. And then the rest is made up of lenders, SBA, HUD, big box stores, attorneys, a lot of different representations in the user and general interest community, as well as EPA. We have the EPA liaison who works closely with us to just kind of make sure we're not deviating away from the minimum requirements for the all appropriate inquiries regulation. And the goal is for users and producers to agree on a consistent process that is expected to result in a consistent deliverable, right? So that's what any standard after, actually, any ASTM standard. And then a fourth bullet on the drivers is that where we see inconsistencies in process and quality, right, those are signals to us where the standard can be improved. And all of you who have done this, you've seen drastic inconsistencies in how these phase one environmental site assessments are conducted. And so, the goal is to try to get more consistency in the practice. And that's what we work towards. All right, now I have to give you a disclaimer. So on the next slide, you're going to see some disclaimer language. Everything that I am sharing here, this is proposed language on these slides. Those are draft. They're currently being reviewed under ballot. And some language changes could still happen. I'm hopeful not at this point, since we're hopeful this is our last ballot. But do be aware that this is proposed language. So what I ask is, don't distribute the proposed language, but if you do, please be clear that this is not final. I encourage people to share among their peers and within their industry. Here's what's coming. This is what the task group is thinking. That's all really good to get that information out there in industry, but we do need to be really clear that it's not final yet until it's final. The other thing that I would ask is, as we go through some of this, consider your own practices, your own requests for proposals that you either issue or that come your way, and consider those in the general context of some of the items that we're going to be discussing today. All right, next slide. We'll talk we got to start with the core of the phase one. What the heck is a REC, right? What's a recognized environmental condition? And those of you who have been practicing this for a long time have a good grounding in that, but it's worth revisiting here. The recognized environmental condition is the outcome of the phase one, presence or likely presence of a release of hazardous substances or petroleum products to the environment due to a release that we know happened, we see it, we have data, we know it happened, due to a release under conditions that indicate a release is likely to have happened, or a material threat of a future release. There's something happening here, some damage or some mismanagement or something. The release hasn't happened, but there are steps that could be taken to avoid the release, right? So due to a release to the environment, we know it, we think it's likely, or it is material threat of it happening. And that's important because the word likely, presence is pretty clear, right? We know it, we see it, or we have data that says that it's there. Where reasonable people differ is on the word likely. And so the task group took on a bit of an effort this time to see, is there anything that we can do to help environmental professionals get a bit more consistent on that piece of the REC definition? So on the next slide, you'll see can likely be defined. And there's a lot of debate about this. We actually started with an actual definition in section 3 of the standard, but likely is used in a lot of different contexts. The word likely is used in a variety of ways, not necessarily related to the REC definition in the standard. So we couldn't have it actually be a standalone definition. But I think we may have some success in adding a note. And if you can pull that up, Scott, a proposed note to add to the REC definition. And again, this is draft, but likely what we're working with is a phrase that says something to the effect that likely is that which is neither certain nor proved, right? It's not absolute, but can be expected or believed based on logic and experience of the EP, right? And what we were trying to get to is to find that middle ground. There's a lot of pushback on environmental professionals. You don't know that a release has happened here. You don't, from that dry cleaner that operated for 40 years. So you can't call it a REC. Well, that's not correct, right? If the environmental professional has reason to believe based on logic and experience, industry, what we know as an environmental professional and our judgment, not certain nor proved. But at the same time, we can't be calling every possibility as a REC, right? You have to have some logic or some reason behind it. So, hopefully that the idea is that's going to give us a little bit more consistency in that likely component of the REC definition. All right, so going on to the next slide, REC versus HREC versus CREC. And so the reason that it was so important, it's so important to be well-grounded in the definition of the REC, is because then we have to, when the release has been addressed, then we need to decide which bucket that goes into as far as a historical REC or a controlled REC. So again, the recognized environmental condition is a presence or likely presence of a release to the environment, right? And then now it's been addressed. So the historical recognized environmental condition, and remember, in 2013, we revised the HREC definition to be only those sites where a past release has been addressed to unrestricted use criteria, right? It once was there, it's been addressed, and it meets unrestricted use criteria. Because HRECs are not RECs because it doesn't meet the presence or likely presence test. Now, the thing that we had to clarify and the thing that we were seeing happening in reports is that people were getting confused and calling other releases on off-site properties as HRECs. And it may be for that site, but we have to stay focused on our site, right? So we added just a little phrase that says past releases affecting the subject property. It really wasn't that critical with respect to HREC, but when consultants got this wrong on the controlled RECs, it was a bigger deal. So the third bullet on this slide, controlled RECs was that new definition introduced in 2013. We did add the same phrase there, past releases affecting the subject property, addressed to some unrestricted use criteria. It says on this slide addressed to non-residential standard, but we actually had to change that because there are some jurisdictions where there is some restricted residential, right? As long as the contamination was below so many feet or whatever. We got some feedback from, I think it was the state of Florida and a couple of others. So we actually had to change that to say unrestricted use criteria. And this one gets really complex because there's just so many ways in so many jurisdictions where this happens. A site has been addressed to some kind of restricted use criteria, either through a regulatory agency, maybe you have a no further action letter, or perhaps self-directed cleanup that meets some kind of a regulatory authority adopted criteria, right? There's just such a variety of ways that this happens. And so there was a lot of discussion on this. And what we did in the standard is we took some of the language that was in the definition of 1527.13, we simplified the wording in the definition and then brought some of the explanatory or additional language into notes or discussion items immediately following the definition. So I'm hopeful that that will help make it a bit more clear for environmental professionals as they're trying to think through which bucket at the end of their evaluation process, REC, HREC, CREC, or de minimis, which bucket it gets into. The next slide, some proposed historical recognized environmental condition discussion points. As I'd mentioned, we've taken some of the language that was embedded in the definition and we've moved in both the HREC and the CREC, some of that language down to discussion points. So here's some where some of the draft language was. Reminding environmental professionals, so identifying the historical rec, it's a multi-step process, right? And we need to discuss this in the findings and opinions section of the report so that you're presenting your rationale for concluding that your finding is an HREC. So when determining whether the rec has been addressed to that satisfaction of the applicable authority, we need to review reasonably ascertainable documentation and relevant data. That's a really important thing we had to get into this standard. You've got the data because you don't know what criteria it was addressed to if you don't have the data. The fact that you just have a no further action letter doesn't answer that question. And then another component of the HREC evaluation is that the past release meets current criteria. That's the second discussion item. And again, we just need to relay that in the findings and opinions section of the report so that a reviewer has a single place where this information is gathered at the end of the report. Some proposed discussion points for the CREC definition. Again, multi-step process. When determining, again, whether it's been addressed, we need to be looking at reasonably ascertainable documentation, such as no further action letters and data. And we need the data to show that we satisfy risk-based criteria, okay? And we need to put that information, a summary of our opinions, the rationale that leads us to that conclusion in the findings and opinions section of the report. On another slide, we have another component of the CREC definition, though, and this is a really important component of the controlled recognized environmental condition. The environmental professional, when they determine that a REC is subject to some type of control, right, we need to, it doesn't mean we verified or confirmed, it's just you need to say what that control is supposed to be, right? It's supposed to remain commercial, or there's a subslab vapor system in, or there's, supposed to be a cap or whatever. That's the control. And then as part of the continuing obligations, a user or a buyer of property needs to make sure that those things are in play. And we need to also look to make sure that there hasn't been a change in regulatory criteria or a change in the use of the property, or maybe there's a pathway that wasn't evaluated. So there are conditions that would actually take what might be a controlled rec and put it right back in the recognized environmental condition camp. On the next slide, you'll see there's a lot of discussion about what is a control, right, to qualify as a controlled recognized environmental condition. So there was a lot of debate about that. We talked about environmental covenants, commercial or industrial zoning, but really a no further action letter with supporting data that meets risk-based criteria. In self-directed investigations or mitigation, that they're meeting some risk-based criteria adopted by a regulatory authority. And all of those things that would fit under that umbrella of what would be a controlled recognized environmental condition. So the environmental professional really does need to be clear in their report on what it is that qualifies this past release that's been addressed as a controlled recognized environmental condition. What is that control, that property use limitation or activity and use limitation? So on the next slide, you'll see what we've done is we've got a new appendix that we've put together to provide some guidance on this decision process. So we've got like a decision tree, and some of you have been to some of my presentations or an ASTM training, you will have seen something similar to this because it's been evolving over time as a training tool. Well, we took that decision tree and put it into an appendix, a flow chart, and then we've been working on some very simple examples to walk through that flow chart to the end decision point. So we're hopeful that that will be useful in getting some consistency in that process. On the next slide, we had to fix something in the standard with respect to third-party provided activity and use limitation searches in land title records, your environmental covenants, your institutional controls. It took us a while to figure out what was happening because the search of land title records has always been a user responsibility, because in most commercial property transactions, they're getting the title work. And so the overall philosophy is let the title professionals do what title professionals do, let environmental professionals do what environmental professionals do. But there are some third-party vendors who have been providing these environmental lien and AUL searches. Now, environmental liens are not really the challenge, because if you've got a multi-million-dollar EPA lien on your property, everybody's going to know that, right? So the problem was these activity and use limitations. And what we found, and first thing on bullet two, I will point out that there are situations where a user, a client, might opt to have the environmental professional contract with a title professional to research land title records, right? But an EP should only be doing that if they're under contract to do so. On the third bullet, though, this is where we found that some of the third-party vendors offering this service had different interpretations of what the 1527.13 was requiring. And so we found that in some of these AUL searches, some of the third-party vendors were only reviewing documents currently recorded against or relating to the property. So they were looking at current owner records only. And the problem is that some of these environmental covenants would have been filed 3 or 4 owners ago and then just incorporated by reference. And so what was happening is that there was inconsistent deliverables, as the fourth bullet says, inconsistent deliverables and activity and use limitations were getting missed. So we needed to do something with respect to that problem. But remember, and the fifth bullet item is the reminder, this is only a problem if the environmental professional is contracting to do the title search. Go back to bullet one. This is a user responsibility. So it's only an issue if the environmental professional is taking on the responsibility of that title search. All right, next slide, records review. We needed to do a little bit of updating what was happening in the physical setting source information. In the 2013 version, the task group had added in the regulatory review that if your property or an adjoining property showed up on one of those standard databases, you needed to review agency file records. Well, so what was happening is that the physical setting source information was staying focused on whatever the data providers were giving them, or whatever published general information that they had, and topographic maps and assumptions about groundwater flow direction and depth. But then over in the regulatory review, they were reviewing, environmental professionals would be reviewing regulatory documentation, and they had investigation reports, groundwater monitoring reports. They had actual site-specific physical setting source information, and they were not connecting that back to the physical setting source section of their report. And so we were seeing inconsistencies in physical setting source information. And why that became a huge problem is because the opinions about the off-site releases not being a concern because physical setting source information said groundwater was flowing away from the property, and and if that was not consistent with the actual site-specific groundwater flow information, all of the assumptions about their government record review was wrong. So it was just a really interesting inconsistency. So the reminder to environmental professional is include physical setting source information that you obtained from agency file reviews. It's not that you need to go review agency files to get physical setting sources. It's a reminder that if you are reviewing agency file records to satisfy the regulatory review component in that section of your report, remember to incorporate that back in your physical setting source information and analysis of other database listings. The second bullet, the government records, the environmental records section was updated. This was a priority for EPA because, as you all know, the CERC list and some of those things have all been combined under the Superfund Enterprise Management System. So we have now SEMS. And what EPA wanted to do was move away from actually identifying specific databases, and they made it more general. So it shouldn't be anything that affects you guys. And then there was the historical research, the third bullet, the historical research update. And that is the issue we spent, this task group has spent the most time working through. So on the next slide, the proposed historical restructuring. So as a reminder, right, we're compiling and analyzing historical information to develop a history of past uses of the property and adjoining properties and surrounding area to help identify the likelihood that we've been impacted, right, that we've got wrecks connected with the property. We cannot lose focus of the question that we're trying to answer. So second bullet, property identification. There's a reminder in here that properties may differ in size and configuration or different addresses than in the past, but the subject property is defined by its current boundaries, right? So whatever it is that you're looking at, whether it's a cell tower or a tenant suite or a multi-parcel property, whatever is the boundaries, we're defining, your user is defining what your subject property is. But it gets more complicated when we're looking at adjoining properties. So we may have to research additional properties, provide further information necessary to achieve the objective. Where information is found, the third bullet, we talk about sources is where we actually find the information, and then the resources are the actual historical research, the document itself. There was some inconsistencies in the standard when those words were used, and we needed to clean that up a little bit. The 8 standard historical sources are mostly the same. The one thing that we did do is we pulled interviews out of the other category and brought interviews up as one of the optional standard historical sources. This was important in the rural communities and the brownfields programs and the tribal programs, because all those other eight historical documents, other than aerials and topo maps, you're not going to find anything else. The only other thing you have is interviews with knowledgeable persons. And so that was an important standard source that the task group wanted to bring up into the standard historical sources. All right, next slide, the proposed historical restructuring. The intervals are unchanged. It still says not required to review at less than 5-year intervals. And in fact, if specific use has not changed over a longer period of time, it's not required to research in between that period. And the same examples are still in there. Second bullet, data failure is substantially unchanged. Remember that the historical research is complete when the objective has been achieved. Have we answered the question? And the third bullet, one of the things that we needed to do, you know, the standard says specific information about uses is more helpful than general information. That's the same thing that we say now, but it has said in the past, if there's industrial use, more specific information shall be reviewed. We needed to expand that a bit this time. And so it says now, if the general type of use is retail, industrial, or manufacturing, then additional standard historical sources shall be reviewed. And let me explain why that is. It's dry cleaners. It's all about dry cleaners and auto service shops in some of the mall settings. And but EPA informed the task group that dry cleaners are the #1 source of new Superfund sites. And information that came from SBA and user communities and the environmental professionals, dry cleaners are a big problem. And we have got to be better at looking for those. And retail is there's all, I was just telling somebody yesterday, there's about as many dry cleaners as there were gas stations, darn near. So we've got to do a better job of identifying those. And in fact, we added a note in the historical research to that effect that says, merely identifying that a building is present may not satisfy the objective. For example, tenant operations in a retail building may have included past dry cleaning or other activities of concern. It's that important that we added a note to the standard to that effect. All right, so next slide. What is good commercial and customary practice? You know, the historical research section of the standard hasn't really changed much since 1993 when it was first published, and there's a challenge with some of the language. One of the things that it says is in prior versions is that you use only as many historical resources as are necessary to achieve the objectives. And some consultants have taken that word only very, very seriously. And there has been substantial problems in our industry because of inadequate historical research in phase 1. And we had to address it. We started to talk about it a little bit as we were looking at modifications for 2013, but the task group didn't take the challenge on then. They preferred to keep it as that flexible, but the problems have just not gotten any better. And there's litigation that supports this. There's all kinds of problems. And so we had to take it on this time. So another place that it says the word only is it says chain of title cannot be the only source, suggesting that any of the others could be the only historical source, as it says in bullet 2 there. So here's what we found out, and we did a lot of industry outreach. What are people doing? What are environmental professionals doing? What are the user groups seeing? And what we found is that by and large, most consultants have been looking at the big 4 historical resources where they're available: aerials, topographic maps, fire insurance maps, and city directories. If they're available for a particular area, for the most part, environmental professionals are reviewing those big 4 in pretty much every case. Now, there are exceptions, and the standard acknowledges that, right? So let's say you're surrounded by residential property. There's no reason for you to have to go look at city directories when you've got aerial photographs and other things that are telling you that it's area, that you've got residential or whatever. Just the environmental, what the standard is going to ask for is you do these four, but if you don't, you explain why, right? Very similar to the agency file reviews, right? If your site your adjoining property shows up on a database, you should review agency file records, but if you don't, you need to explain why. Very same concept. And then after that, the 4th bullet says the environmental professionals use other resources depending on various factors. That's pretty much reflecting what consultants do. Next slide for the subject property, we're going back to first developed or 1940 or first developed use. That's unchanged. We talked about, right, we have these 4 sources. The second bullet, the following standard resources shall be reviewed if reasonably ascertainable, likely to be useful and subject to and applicable to the subject property. And if not reviewed, you just say why. Additional standard historical sources shall be reviewed if needed to satisfy the objectives. So those are the 4 bullet points on the subject property. Other resources can be used, but they're not required. Right, bullet 5. Where it really got interesting is when we started talking about adjoining properties. That's what's on the next slide. And first bullet, recent litigation regarding insufficient review of adjoining properties. It's very real. People are missing things, consultants are missing things, and whether it even gets to lawsuits, lenders and SBA and other users were bringing stories to the task group about sites that got missed, impacts to the subject property. There was something maybe on an adjoining property the consultant didn't identify as a concern, and it turned out it was actually on the property because the parcel split or the address numbers changed. So adjoining properties were just such a higher risk. So EPA and the environmental professionals have been interpreting 1527.13 differently. Bullet 2 says uses of the area surrounding the property shall be identified, but this task is required only to the extent that the information is revealed in the course of researching the property. Well, so there's that word only again. And some have taken that very, very seriously and just not looked. But I do want to point out, because where the real debate was happening is with city directories, but I need to point out that in the 1527 and earlier versions, you'll see the highlight there on the third bullet that local city directories for more than a few streets may be too time consuming. So the standard is already expecting that you're at least looking next door, right? So going to the next slide, here's where the task group has wound up, is that during research of the subject property, uses of the adjoining properties that are identified shall be identified, and this task requires reviewing those big four historical sources if they've been researched for the subject property, if it provides coverage of one or more of the adjoining properties, and if it's likely to be useful in satisfying the objective, right? And if not, you just say why. And then additional standard historical sources should be reviewed if, in the environmental professional's opinion, additional review is warranted, again, to satisfy the objective. We retained some of the factors to consider that are already in the current standards, just to give some guidance that we're not expecting this to be a research every single item that might be out there, just to help provide some boundaries. And then the final bullet says, as does with the subject property, that we can use other historical resources, but it's not required. We do on the next slide, we have a new definition for significant data gap. There was a lot of confusion and a lot of different interpretation on what does that mean? What is a significant data gap? Right? And so we defined it. Right? A significant data gap is that data gap that is so big, the hole in the information is so big that it affects your ability to identify wrecks. And that was important. So you can have all reports have data gaps, right? Where there's just not enough time or money to operate in a world of perfect information. So we've all got data gaps, but it's the significant data gap is that affects your ability to identify wrecks. That's a big hole. And it's important because when we get to what we've put into what we're proposing for the conclusion section, that significant data gap is going to come back up again. So going to the next slide, strengthening the deliverable. Do users want a more robust and detailed report, but that doesn't mean bigger and useless information, right? So some of the revisions are, first of all, we went through the standard and we were consistent on use of the words of subject property. So we were very clear when we're talking about property in general or the subject property. Include your rationale for your HREC and CREC determinations in the opinions and findings section of your report. Some more robust and detailed discussion on how significant data gaps are affecting your opinion, right? So it's one thing to say, I have a significant data gap. I have no idea what the historical use of the property is, right? Just to make that statement. But then to explain how that's affecting your opinion. And it's going to carry over into the conclusion section of the report, and I'll discuss that in a moment. On bullet 4, yeah, put in photos and a site map, bullet 5. there's nothing in the standard that has ever said you need to put in pictures in a map. And it's astounding that on the lower end of deliverables, on the lower end, lower quality phase ones that are being produced out there, they don't have pictures or maps. And but good commercial customary practice reflecting, what the bulk of the industry is doing. Yeah, put in pictures, especially representative of, your areas of concern, and at least give a site map and tell where you're located on planet Earth. And one thing that's not on here, but I just want to mention that is that in the conclusion section of the report, I think where we're going to land is that the conclusion section will be to identify recognized environmental conditions and significant data gaps. And let me explain why. What the user community wanted to see in their reports is, don't just put a significant data gap. If it's affecting your ability to reach a conclusion, don't just bury it in the report somewhere. You're going to have it in your limitations section. But if your conclusion is qualified by some significant data gap, some huge piece of information that you don't know, that's fine. But the reviewer of the report really needs to know that, right? Because it could completely invalidate your conclusion. They need to at least understand that it's basically a conditional conclusion. So you'll probably see that change. Next slide, we have PFAS, PFOS. Everybody wants to know what we're doing about PFAS, PFOS, and it's a good question, right? It's an emerging contaminant. We're just trying to figure out how to grapple with this. It's not the first time we've had this problem, but the timing of it is interesting with the revision of 1527. But we can't speak to it as specifically because, like I said, PFAS today, it'll be something else tomorrow. But what we did do is it's a reminder of what's in what the tool, the 1527 tool, was designed for, and it's a liability protection for releases of CERCLA hazardous substances and petroleum products. And right now, PFAS is not yet regulated as a CERCLA hazardous substance. So it falls under this category of emerging contaminants. And that is outside of the scope of the 1527. But keep in mind that as soon as it becomes regulated as a CERCLA hazardous substance, and it's coming, then it is immediately brought into the fold. There is some language in the appendix that talks about emerging contaminants and uses PFAS as an example. But we needed to be careful not to craft language that was specific to a particular chemical. The other thing that I'll point out is that in section 1, and I want to say it's 1.4, there's already language in there that is a reminder to users and producers that there may be other substances, there may be other that are regulated under state, local, or even other federal laws that may be important. And I would point you to that section to deal with PFAS right now. Have the conversation. If this is being regulated in your area, have that conversation with your client and look to that section to help guide that discussion about whether or not you need to bring that into the scope. And remember, releases or threatened releases, you don't even necessarily have to identify a substance. If you've had manufacturing or, something else where this kind of a chemical may have been present, you don't need to point out the substance specifically necessarily. Just releases in general would be sufficient. And then deal with the PFAS in the phase 2 component, which is much broader than just CERCLA hazardous substances. So just some ideas on how some consultants are handling these kinds of things. All right, to wrap up, how will these changes affect me? As a reminder, these changes reflect a compilation of industry input from all across the country and professionals who have come to share their own internal processes and structures and what they see and what's happening out there. So second bullet says, environmental professionals that are producing quality deliverables are likely to see very little change in your process. You may need to change some structure, maybe be more consistent in some of your historical research, But if you're doing a quality job, what we have coming out in the new standard, it really should reflect what you're doing. If it's not, I would double check the current standard, make sure you're compliant with what the standard right now is telling you to do. And the other thing to just to be aware of is it's what your peers are doing. It's reflecting what some of the legal problems that we're seeing out there. So if you're not doing some of this stuff already, yeah, you want to consider maybe stepping it up a bit and improving the process. All right, that's what I have for you guys, kind of as a summary, high-level summary of what's going on.
Julie, thank you so much for the information. I'm going to open it up to questions. We've got about 3 minutes remaining in our presentation time. So if anyone wants to come off of mute, put questions in chat, we'll entertain those now.
If we have no questions, I hope that means everybody's like, yeah, this is pretty cool. Yeah, it's pretty close to what we're doing already.
Yeah, this would be a first. There's hours.
I got one.
Go ahead.
Just going back, you had said that, on your slide of title search being a user requirement, not an EP requirement. Is it the same feeling for the AULs and lien searches and things like that? That's really on the user rather than the EP to research?
So, yeah, good question. The land title record is what is the user responsibility. So if you have activity and use limitations that are recorded in land title records, you're asking your client, have you had your title report done, and are you aware of any environmental liens or AULs in that title report? That's your role as the environmental professional. Now, if you have activity and use limitations that are identified elsewhere, like in a regulatory agency file or a database, that's on you, right? That's the stuff the environmental professional is researching. So it's the land title records that are specific to the user responsibility. Just make sure you ask them if they have it.
Okay, so basically anything that would be deed recorded at the county level rather than this, rather than in a regulatory file necessarily is their responsibility.
Yeah, anything in the land title record is their responsibility. Anything in the regulatory file is yours.
Okay. All right, thank you.
Julie, hi, this is Jonathan Skaggs from GSI here in Austin.
Hi.
I have a quick question. Great presentation, by the way. I have a quick question about PFAS again. Here in Texas, 16 PFAS have what we call PCLs, or protective concentration levels. So above which would be considered, you'd need to do some sort of additional work. They're not CERCLA hazardous substances, but a release of them would trigger state requirements for further assessment or response action. Yeah. Is there anything in the new standard that changes how that would change, moving forward and trying to assess those at sites? It seems like even under the current standard, because they're regulated by the state of Texas in that way, you would still need to sort of think about them, and you wouldn't just be able to say, well, they're not hazardous substances, so we're not going to look into them, because it would trigger a state regulatory program.
Yeah, and that's why I point you to, and I could be off on the number because I don't have it right here in front of me, but 1.4 or somewhere right around there in the current standard, in the 1527.13, there's discussion specific to that reminder that there may be issues beyond CERCLA hazardous substances or petroleum products that may need to be evaluated under different programs, and you need to be aware of them. So that's the kind of thing that I'm saying is, so there's nothing in the new standard that really changes any of that. But okay. I do want to just mention, you, like I said, in the phase one, you don't necessarily have to identify a particular substance, right? I mean, where there's PFAS, there may be other stuff as well. What I'm saying is you may be able to just bring it into your report as in there's been this manufacturing or there's been this activity in this known or maybe a
fire training area.
However it is, right? and it's been your experience that there are likely to be releases associated with that activity, and just bring it in more generally and not necessarily specifying the constituent of concern. There's nothing in the standard that says you have to identify which constituent you're worried about, if that makes sense.
Mm-hmm. Perfect. Thanks so much.
Mm-hmm.
I have a quick question, and it just along those same lines is, as I approach doing a phase one, I enjoy having other consultants' reports or my report identify those, constituents of concern that might be in the soil or groundwater. So if I was doing a report that was next to a fire training center in Texas, I would want to say there might be potential for this contaminant, because when you come down to do the phase two, it's nice to know what you're dealing with.
Well, I understand what I do. I understand what you're saying. I guess I'm thinking kind of a parallel to, for example, dry cleaners, right? So when we write up a phase one, and I'm just using this as an example, releases from dry cleaners releases of chlorinated solvents or releases from dry cleaners are common, and that is the recognized environmental condition, right? So I'm just offering that there are ways to work around this where you can identify the likelihood of releases, and then you identify your specific constituents perhaps when you're drafting up phase two scope of work, which isn't tied so specifically to CERCLA hazardous substances or petroleum products. I mean, frankly, and EPA says the same thing. Remember, at the time that PCB, Patricia Overmeyer said this on something we did just the other day, when PCBs were released in the Hudson River, they weren't regulated at the time, but that didn't stop the Hudson River from becoming a Superfund site later on. So we just need to be aware that this stuff is out there. It's not regulated yet. It doesn't fit within the box of the 1527 that was designed for releases of CERCLA hazardous substances or petroleum products. But y'all know what you're dealing with out there. And so bring it in however it is you think you need to bring it in.
Okay, thank you.
It seems like some of that stuff could happen inside conversations with your client, depending on to make sure that they understand any potential liabilities. But it doesn't necessarily have to be everything you tell your client doesn't have to end up in writing in a phase one report.
Yeah. In some respects, part of what the 1527 box is trying to provide for you right now, if you know there's a PFAS issue next door, if you know you're next to a fire training, you know that it's being regulated at a state level, yeah, you got to bring this stuff in, however you need to bring it in. But it's really more for those areas where it's not been identified yet. There's uncertainty. It's not regulated yet. And what will happen is people are going to start suing each other. And so this tool is just intended to give you a little bit of that protection, right? In the event that turns out to be something happening in your area. It's going to be much, much more difficult if you are in an area where you know that it's regulated and you know that it's there, or you suspect that it might be. Bring it in however you need to bring it in.
Awesome. Well, that is the end of our time. Julie, do you have contact information that if there's additional follow-up questions, someone can reach out to you?
Absolutely. So that second slide has my email and telephone number. Scott knows how to find me. Yeah, actually, you can just Google me, unfortunately. I'm hard to find.
Awesome. Well, this recording along with the slide deck will be posted on our ICE member page here in the coming day or so. So please look for that. Take a picture of the screen with your phone if you need our contact information immediately. Otherwise, that will be readily available for you in the near future. Thank you guys for attending. Julie, thank you so much for your presentation today. was wonderful. And
All right. Well, thanks for the invite.
awesome. All right, everyone have a great summer, and we'll see you back in August.
All right. Thanks, guys.
Thank you.
Yep.